Hi, my name is Marcus, and this is a companion podcast for the CG Jung-helpdesk meetup group. I host live events on Zoom every 2 weeks about the concepts and ideas of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Every event I give a presentation about the Jungian concept, so have fun with this event's topic.
And we would begin for a very special topic where I'm very glad that so many people showed up because it's, I think, the driest title I ever had. It's physics and numbers, and it's super, super interesting. So I was looking forward to this event for a long time because what I do really like now is to go in the very deep, esoteric, special stuff that close to no one knows about Jung and stuff he talked about, and brings these things to the group and present them. So today it will be physics and numbers with a subtitle of spirit and matter, and we will explore why that might be a very fitting subtitle for that. And I want to begin with the physics part, and I want to begin with a special experiment that was done in the 20th century. It was called the Michelson-Morley experiment. Why is this important? It is important because nobody could really explain physically why sunlight reaches the Earth. Because normally when you have things in the natural world, you have a medium of transport. For example, when we speak and use our voice cords, we make the air vibrate and then it reaches the ear of the other person. So we vibrate the air so that the other person can hear what we say. The problem is in space you have a vacuum. So there was never really an explanation why sunlight would reach the Earth. Except there was this idea there might be something like the ether. And this is a very old idea already from the Greek culture and intellectual thought, that there might be something we cannot really see, we cannot really feel, but they tried to find a way how to measure it. And they had a very interesting and complex system set up of of a light source and different mirrors that would take different amounts of time based on the ether by the fact that the Earth is moving through space. I don't want to go too much into detail, but I want to say you can do this basically at home as a little thing with mirrors and a detector and all these different things, where you then measure the interference of the same light source being reflected through a longer way and a shorter way. But if you really want to double down and prove it, you invest a lot of money. And this Michelson-Morley experiment is famous because they really invested millions of dollars. And they've done it in the US. And they did not do it on the kitchen table. They did it really outside. They did it on mountains. So they had a light source, a laser, set up with different mirrors that were on top of mountains to reflect and measure how long it would take the light to come back. And they set all this up for a lot of money, and they really needed to measure millimeters between mountaintops. And then they had an earthquake. So this messed up all the distances, and they had to start again. And finally, after they set up everything again and they measured it, they found out nothing happened. There was absolutely no difference between the longer light, the light that took the longer way and the shorter way. And everybody was very confused. And basically, they were not able to prove the ether. A lot of money spent, a lot of time invested, but there was one man who was not really surprised by the fact, and that man was called Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein did not invest millions of dollars to prove anything or even to test anything. The very, very cruel fact about Einstein is all he did and all he had was a piece of paper and a pencil. And what he's done was thought experiments. And what he's been doing is just bringing himself into a situation and trying to anticipate internally in his imagination what would happen in certain situations. For example, when he was 16, his first thought experiment was about chasing a beam of light. What if he would run as fast as a beam of light? How would it look to him? Would it be like static? Would it be like a rod? Or how would it look like? And they already had some good intuitions about light being a wave. And he also had other ideas about the train that gets struck by runs at the speed of light and is struck by lightning in the front and in the back. And the question is, would it for an outside person look like this happens simultaneously or one after the other? The solution is no, it would for an outside person look a difference, even though that it would be a lightning strike. And also the idea of an elevator that when it moves up, presses you down. And the question is like, how is this difference from gravity, for example? And the answer is, well, it's not that different. And this is how you can simulate gravity in certain circumstances and bring up forces there, and so on and so on. So this is an interesting thing about Albert Einstein, who lived a long time ago, so in the last century. And just by his imagination, just by his mind, he was able to come up with concepts and ideas that were proven right again and again and again. As I said, he did not really do experiments. He had thought experiments. He just thought things up and said, yeah, that makes sense. And it was for all the other people trying to prove their theories, like Michelson and Morley about the ether, bringing the measurements that would show that Einstein is right. And we know that Einstein is right, because would Einstein not be right, we would not have something like satellite communication, because we have to take those effects into account, otherwise it would not work. So what we have is people who are able to anticipate certain things about the physical world long time before they're able to be proven. And there's a long list for that. That people had certain ideas that they say, well, actually, the physical world should work like this, or we should find things on the atomic level or subatomic level, things we cannot really see, measure, feel at that point in time, but they should be there to make sense of all of it. For example, Wolfgang Pauli had this idea about the neutrino, and this was proven 26 years later. And there's other things like gravitational waves that took 99 years to prove. And antimatter in general also took up to 27 years to have the measurements to prove what other people have thought before to be right. And the Higgs boson, this is a very recent example. It's well in my memory because they built this huge collider in CERN in Switzerland. And it's just like a huge loop of magnetic coils that accelerate particles and just crash them into each other to break them apart and then measure stuff. Yeah, it took 48 years between hypothesizing that there is something like a Higgs boson that gives mass to things, and then show it like, oh yeah, this is actually real. So it's very interesting, this thought to say, that's kind of strange that human beings can kind of anticipate and think up how the world is supposed to work, like outside, because like psychologically, imagination, this is inside. Like how can it correspond so well to the outside world that we can predict it? And if we want to prove it, like we have to invest massive amounts of money, and very smart people have to do incredible things for a very, very long time, just then to prove something that somebody thought up before. And here we bring in Jung, because Jung thought also about this, and of course he is not the first one, and he has a very nice quote. For the hand that divided light from darkness, and the hand that made heaven and earth, has done likewise in the microcosm below, having taken from the above and enclosed within man's skin everything that heaven contains. This is not a completely unique Jungian idea. It's a hermetical idea. It's from alchemy. It means that we find in the body and in our mind what is outside, as a kind of introduction. And Jung talked about this really a lot. His idea about archetypes and our natural psychology that we have, he says these things were shaped by outside experiences. into our psyche, into our human nature. For example, when he would analyze dreams and you would dream of an animal, he would say, it does not really matter what you as a person know about an animal. You might know some things, you might know the wrong things, but very likely you don't know everything. When you, for example, dream of a penguin or fox or wolf, that he would say the best way to approach such a dream is to look into natural science books to see how the animal lives and reacts in the natural world. Because he says, the thing that's happening there in your dream is not really what you know about a wolf, but rather what your psyche, what your lower part, your unconscious knows about that. And he says that's actually a lot because we're part of nature. We're very connected to that. And our psyche is formed by that. This is how he can bring these things together, this absolute hyper-objectivity of physics or natural science in general that through the scientific method tries to remove the human experience from it to create something absolute that it's existing and true without humans interfering or human perception. And then the very, very subjective experience of one's own psychology. And this makes it then very, very interesting to combine, again, both. And fun fact, Jung and Einstein, they knew each other because they worked together in Zurich at ETH, the university there. And they would have, for example, dinner together and then talk about their different areas of expertise. And Jung would say, like, he would listen to Einstein talk for like hours and feel incredibly small. And he would say, like, oh, he does not understand anything. Everything, it's all very confusing when Einstein would talk about his ideas of relativity before they were published and known to the world. Jung said, but the later the evening got, the better it got, because then Jung would talk and Einstein would be very confused about the things that Jung is talking about that are interesting him. So, what is interesting there to contemplate, as I said before, for science and the scientific method, really it is to remove human fallacy, judgment, psychological trappings, heuristics, and so on. This is why it's so incredibly hard to think and work like a scientist, because you have to remove the human experience out of it completely. This is why it takes a very long time. This is why multiple people look over it to take the biases of a single person out of it. But at the same time, what you heard before from the thought experiments from Einstein, like he put himself into those thought experiments. So he did like the opposite approach. Like, I don't know, he would not say it's completely objective and removed from human experience, but he would say, oh, what if I'm on a sled traveling at the speed of light and I turn on my flashlight? What if I run next to a beam of light and I'm as fast as it? How would it look like? This is an embodied experience. This is not a removed objective experience. And Jung would very much approve of this because this is the basis of symbolic thinking. And this is why it's so hard to think symbolically, let's say, for a modern person, because you have to be removed from the abstract and go more in the hyper-subjective. What we have here in the quote, for example, right? The hand that divided light from darkness, right? That's the same hand, so the hand of God, that also separated the sky and the heavens. The experience that we have of heaven and earth is that it's half-half in our field of view. If we look at the horizon, we can see the upper half at the sky, the lower half is the earth. So for us, it's equal measures. But if you, of course, zoom out and would say like, oh, no, we are on a little rock in the vastness of space. So it is very, very little earth and a lot of sky and emptiness. That's a completely different approach. And this is a very unnatural approach, let's say, to experience and it's existing. But this is now what it's more familiar to us today. So another point where the hard science of physics and the objective facts and subjective experience come together is in quantum physics. And I will talk a little bit about quantum physics because this is a field that also came up roughly around the time where Jung was very active. So beginning of the 20th century. And the fun is, again, there were people proclaiming, Lord Kelvin in this case, that there is nothing new to be discovered in physics now. All that remains is more and more precise measurements. So the science, humanity thought, oh, we know how the world works because we have Newtonian physics, we have gravity, we have forces, we know how everything works mechanically. And this was up to the point where people discovered that how the world works in a lower level, on the atomic level, is very different than it works on the macroscopic level, on the Newtonian level. So this is where you get into particle physics and in quantum physics, because at the quantum level, the world is very, very weird. And there are mysteries there that we have not solved yet completely. But one mystery I want to tell you about, because it's very famous, is the one of Schrödinger's cat. The idea is that you have like a box and you put a cat inside and you put like a radioactive material inside and you close the box. And the question is now like, is a cat dead or is it alive? And how people normally answer for that is that they say, oh, the cat is kind of both. It's in an in-between state until you open the box and then see what happens. And this example is very famous. Like I almost, there was a time in television and in film and movies where you would have a smart character talking about Schrödinger's cat and trying to explain it like this, to sound very, very smart, to say like, oh, the cat is both. The cat is both dead and alive at the same time. But there would be one person who would strongly disagree, and that's Schrödinger. And this is something I'm very glad to be able to talk about because most people don't know this. Like Schrödinger gives this example and said, oh, that does not make any sense at all. He would say this is how on a quantum level, how it looks like when we have particles moving that depending on whether someone looks or not, it behaves like a particle or a wave. There have been 2 Nobel Prizes, by the way, for that. One for proving that a photon behaves like a particle, another Nobel Prize for proving that it behaves like a wave. And interesting enough, that were father and son disproving each other or proving rather a paradoxical thing that it's happening at the same time. And this is what we know about quantum physics, that things happen and are strange when we look at them. And this is also what was very interesting to Jung. And this is what the quote is about. This essay was inevitable. It was inevitable that the systematic investigation of the unknown center of the atom, which has led to the conclusion that the observed systems is also a disturbance caused by observation, would show that the essence of the observing process will be perceptible in the disturbance causes by the actual observation. To put it more simply, if you look long enough into a dark hole, then you perceive what is looking in. Hence, this is the principle of perception in yoga, which derives all perception from the absolute emptiness of consciousness. This method of cognition is thus a special case of the introspective exploration of the psychic in general. What is Jung saying here? And this is something I want to emphasize. Same as with Schrödinger's cat. Quantum physics is very often used in New Age circles to say like, oh, we can change the world by perceiving it and like imposing will on it, let's say, thinking about it. We can manifest things, for example, on a physical realm. Which is an idea taken from quantum physics as saying like, yeah, well, if you perceive the photon, it will behave differently. But at the same time, it does not work like this on the macroscopic level. Saying the cat is likely dead. But Jung, again, when he thinks about these things and looks at it, says there's something way more interesting, which is saying you have the possibility to perceive yourself through things that you are observing, because everything that you observe, you fill with your own psyche, with your own psychology, and you have it reflected back on yourself. So this is why he connects quantum physics to yoga, because in yoga, the emptying of the mind allows for a deeper view inside, and you start seeing yourself in the vast emptiness of your own mind when you calm it through yoga meditation. At the same time, warning about yoga meditation for European people. So, but this is Jung, always complicated. Why Jung in the context of quantum physics is also very interesting. I said before that Lord Kelvin said that all the physics is now known. It's Newtonian, it's mechanical. We have fixed laws. We have simple models that always work. I saw a very nice example linking Freud to that and the Freudian model of the mind, that you say like, oh yeah, you have like these couple of constants and they work in predictable ways with each other. And you, for example, have a building up of pressure and this pressure needs to be released, right? This is a concept of psychoanalytic thought. And this is very deterministic and mechanistic in causal, like it's pretty clear how stuff ends up in different places. Like you have stuff that ends up in the unconscious because it comes out of the id, and the superego disposes of it because it's against society's rules, and then it's in the wastebasket of the unconscious. And this is why it's pretty easy to explain Freud, because you have a couple of rules, you have a couple of models, and that goes very easy and quickly. Of course, there's more to Freud than what I explained, but we could cover Freud in maybe half an hour or 45 minutes pretty extensively. But then you have something that was followed up by this. Same as Newton was followed up by all this particle physics and quantum physics, which is incredibly difficult because it's more probabilistic and states that are happening at the same time. And everything is very much entangled and interconnected and influences each other. You have Jung also kind of progressing out of Freudian psychology, out of a deterministic causal way of seeing the psyche, into something that's so complex to explain that I've been trying it now for 4 years. Showing in a high interconnectedness and high, like more probabilistic, dualistic fact and paradoxical facts about the psyche and the effects that are happening there. So there's a very nice parallel running there in the discovery of the psyche, but also, again, in physics. And there's more to just physics than that. And it has to do with the archetypes and how Jung really saw archetypes working and how he saw the works of psychology and the works of physics. And I have a quote for that. Comparing modern psychology with modern physics is not empty talk. Despite their diametrically opposed fields, both disciplines have one highly significant point in common. Both approach the previously transcendental sphere of the invisible and untouchable, the world of pure analogical thinking. The truth of physics can be convincingly demonstrated by the explosion of an H-bomb. Psychological truth is far less spectacular and is only apparent to those who are educated in the natural sciences and also have knowledge in numerous other often distant branches of knowledge that have never been considered from a psychological point of view or only very superficially or incompetently. What Jung means at that point, it circles back to what we talked about in the beginning. That people can come up with concepts and ideas of things they cannot touch and feel directly. Just as in physics, like what Einstein has been doing, like, oh, how do planets relate to each other, right? What are black holes? Like coming up with the idea of black holes, and also neutrinos, Higgs boson, all these different things. And even the idea of the atom being a Greek word meaning the undividable, is an idea that already existed in ancient Greece. And to prove that there's such a thing as an atom exists took millennia. to get the right instruments to show this. But the idea existed before and it turned out to be right up to a certain level. As soon as you had particle physics, suddenly nothing makes sense anymore. But Jung says we do the same thing with the psyche. He says the approach is the same. You hypothesize about the world and how it works, and you then expect certain results coming out of that. And we have the same thing in psychology. What Jung has been doing is hypothesizing a lot how the psyche works and what it does. And similar to Einstein, a lot of stuff that Jung talked about was later kind of proven right. These ideas of, for example, evolutionary psychology, that things become ingrained in our psyche through repetition and time, is now a completely valid field of study. Or even something like a personality. We can not directly measure personality, but rather we measure the effects and results of personality. I remember when Trump won the first time, there was a very special company. I forgot the name, something Analytica. They would create psychological profiles from Facebook users and feed them specific advertisement tailored to their psychological profile. That was a huge scandal back then when it came out, and which likely shifted to a certain fractions of a percent the election results in that election in 2016. So we have certain psychological effects we cannot measure directly, same as physicists were not able to do in the past, but we have psychological concepts and ideas that kind of turn out to be right. So what is there important to understand in the context of linking a physical law to archetypes is you cannot measure directly an archetype the same way you cannot measure directly a physical law. Like, for example, gravity. You see the effects of gravity and you can build a model. But you can say the model is just a kind of expression of the thing. It's not the thing itself. Same with an archetype. When you have, for example, the mother archetype or the feminine archetype in general, it can have many, many different expressions that share similarities, but point to something that is more complex in a center. This is why Jung would look at all these different fields of human culture and human endeavor to find their commonalities that he could then use to point to that archetype that kind of links everything internally where we cannot really see it. Same as physical laws we cannot see, but we can see the effect of physics all around us all the time. So another way where Jung and physics and the physical interacts is about synchronicity. And this is something that is very known to a lot of people, at least a name. And it's always very, very hard to explain because you again talk about connections that are not immediately visible and not necessarily logical. So in Newtonian physics, everything is cause and effect, right? So one thing causes the others, is very causally linked. But if we go into Jungian psychology and in particle physics, weird stuff is happening, like weird coincidences that seem to not really have a causal relation, but are connected kind of through meaning. They're happening at the same time. This is why it's called synchronicity. Synchronous things are happening. And one might know some weird examples where there were just weird things happening, where it's kind of, that's strange. Jung would describe these as strange coincidences, and I have a quote for that. Synchronicity could be understood as an ordering system by means of which similar things coincide without there being any apparent cause. I have an example just of my normal waking life. So I met a girl on Friday and she had a bruised rib cage because she fell down in the bathtub. And yeah, it hurt a lot, she says. And the day after, I met a friend, and that friend had problem with his shoulders, like he clamped in his nerve and he could not move his arm correctly. And the next day I come to work and there's our head of IT and she said, she can't move her arm because she has an inflamed elbow. And I say, that's weird. That's strange. Like why all these things? Why this movement or this limitation of upper body movement and that for 3 people, like right after the other? I don't know the meaning completely. This would need to be investigated. But this would be an example for a strange coincidence where suddenly stuff gets ordered or happening more often. Jung also had an example where he, for example, would have a kind of dream of somebody dying, and then days later he would get the notice that the person died at that day, but the person was on the other side of the earth. This is why the letter took so long to get to him. So there is things seemingly happening at the same time that have not really a causal relationship, but are connected there through meaning. And there's another quote for that. Among the things that are part of the substance of the psychic are psychoid archetypes. The characteristic that is peculiar to the archetype is that it manifests itself not only subjectively, but also physically objectively. In other words, it is possible that it can be proved to be both a psychic inner occurrence and also a physical external one. In regard to this phenomenon as an indication of the fact that the physical and psychic matrix is identical. And here comes the cool part. Jung came not up with this idea all by himself, but someone helped him, someone incredibly famous. And that was Wolfgang Pauli, which I mentioned before, came up with the neutrino, and who was also very important for particle physics, quantum physics. And they had a very strong friendship, out of which the idea of synchronicity happened, because Pauli was also very interested in psychology. And there's an amazing seminar on the dreams of Pauli called Dream Symbols of the Individuation Process. And there's also Alchemy in Psychology, where Jung talks about the dreams of a troubled young man who is brilliant, but is lacking his feeling function. And this is very cool to have 2 incredibly powerhouses working together. And you can also buy the letters of them talking together and linking physics and psychology strongly to each other and seeing there's maybe not such a difference between the things above and the things below, the things outside and the things inside, and trying to connect those. And I drew really a lot from those letters for this event. So it is then interesting how like great minds know each other, like Jung and Einstein and Jung and Pauli. And I want to move on to the next topic, which has to do with numbers, because I did not only promise to talk about physics, but also to talk about numbers. And Jung has a quote for that also. Whole number possesses that characteristic of the psychoid archetype in classical form. Namely, they are as much inside as outside. Thus, one can never make out whether they have been devised or discovered. As numbers, they are inside, and as quantity, they are outside. Accordingly, the possibility can be predicted that the equations can be devised from purely mathematical prerequisites, and that later they will turn out to be formulations of physical processes. I therefore believe that from the psychological point of view at least, the sought-after borderland between psychic and psychology lies in the secret of the number. Hence, saying fittingly enough that man made mathematics, but God made the whole numbers. Again, we have this connection between, we can, let's say, count things in the outside world, but at the same time, we have something abstract as a number. And with physics or mathematics, we can predict things about the world and how the world will behave Even though that we could always argue like, okay, yeah, it needs to happen first in the real world. What we can do digitally now in simulations can be predict how rockets will behave or how cars will bend in a car accident. This comes all back to a kind of abstract sphere and world that feeds into ours, that there's a connection there. And when you have people that think mathematically or physically or symbolically, that they move between those worlds, between the abstract, we have the underlying pattern, and then those specific expressions. But of course, this is not all what Jung talks about numbers. I want to talk about a little bit numbers in symbology, which means like, what do we do when we encounter numbers or, let's say, quantities in our psyche, in our dreams, in our symbology? And there's another quote for that. The motive of multiplicity indicates a splitting of the soul. We find this motive particularly often in the dreams of schizophrenics. So we find the dreamer in a desolate, split world in which there is only one being, but it is split off, far away in the distance, too far to reach, standing helpless in a situation of introversion, unable to move forward or backward. The important thing here is really the splitting of the soul. Jung sees it that when things are in the unconscious, so below our level of consciousness, they kind of disintegrate. They're not connected. A little bit like the Tower of Babel, that was one thing, but then was struck and things multiplied and broke apart. He says, when we look into the psyche, we have there a rather different view. So we have in our unconscious many, many separate things that look rather separated from each other, but can be connected in a single thing. The example that he had here for the schizophrenics, schizo and phrenic meaning the split frenulum, so the split mind. Jung would say that they would encounter multitudes of, for example, insects or animals or animals that would show this split of the mind and the splitting apart of a unifying idea into many, many different things. So when you dream of multiple things of the same thing, they're still somehow related, even though that they look separated. Okay, this sounds now very complicated, but I have a better example for that. You might be familiar with a lot of imagery of the gate, where you often have like two guardians guarding a kind of threshold to another realm. So you have one statue or multiple statues. For example, in the Never-Ending Story, you have these gate of the two sphinxes that kill anything that's not pure of heart when it goes through. And you have this also, for example, on the tarot card of the moon, where you have the kind of dualities of the two towers that open up the unknown world, but also you have the wolf and the dog as a multitude of the same thing, but facets of the same thing. And this is also why it's always difficult to talk about symbology. But I hope it's a little bit clear what Jung means when there should be paid special attention to how things are split up or numbered in dreams or in motives or in imagery, because this very often means that things are separated, split off, unconscious. They are not yet working in a harmonious way. But Jung would go further than that again. And this is a little bit a fun thing. So this sounded all very abstractly now. But every time I think to myself, what Jung talks about, it could be anything, right? You can just hypothesize a lot of things, but whether it's actually happening or not is another thing. Until, for me at least, I hit certain experiences where I say, oh my God, basically what Jung's saying is makes a lot of sense. And I have here an example that I'm pretty proud of that I've noticed it. And he talks about numbers in an odd or even way, meaning whether they are masculine or they're feminine in their attributes. Here it's very important to understand that masculinity and femininity does not mean male and female. We're talking about psychological forces. We're talking about symbolic forces. So masculine as the active, feminine as the receptive and resting, let's say. And you think like, yeah, okay, could be anything. But at the same time, when we look how we use symbols, when we want to have something move, we have a triangle with 3 corners, which is an odd number, which brings movement, and this is symbolically associated with active, striving, masculine forces. And if we want things to rest, we have the symbol with the 4 corners that says like, stop, anything that's happening now will now rest. Now it's harmonious, complete, stop. And this is how we have the play button and the stop button. And we have that in almost every app. And we don't really think about it, why it is like that. And I look at this and say, oh, well, basically, like from a symbolical point of view, that kind of makes sense. And then it goes even further. For all the people who are living in Berlin and are familiar with the Berlin trains, we have a very big ring around like the center of Berlin that is 37 kilometers. And we have 2 trains running in opposite directions called the Ringbahn, the ring train. And here, again, it is funny how symbolically things moving to the right are masculine, moving into consciousness, and things moving left go in the unconscious, like feminine. And Jung saw this similar movement and also in a funny way in the movement of the swastika of the Nazis, because the swastika is a very old symbol and it's moving in the old Indian way. It's moving to the right. It's moving into consciousness, right? And the furthering of consciousness. But the Nazis, they flipped it around so that it moves to the left in the unconscious. So it becomes then very interesting that you have a regressive back to the primitive, back to the nature movement, unconscious movement that's abandoning civilization, basically, that has a symbol that moves to the left. And I don't want to say similarly, but on a similar note in regards to movement, we have the Berlin Ringbahn, where the one with the odd number, the masculine number, moves in the clockwise direction, and the one with the feminine number, the 42, moves in the counterclockwise direction. And I have to say, this is the way how I remember which one goes in which direction. Because Jung helps to understand the Berlin train system. Yeah. So these are the things that Jung talked about with numbers, in regards to numbers. And I hope there were some examples here that were also easily understandable and applicable to people when they, for example, come to Berlin. I want to wrap this up. What I want to say and what Jung wants to say about physics and numbers in psychology is that we as human beings have kind of the possibility to reach things of the outside world also through our inside perception and experience and awareness, which is possible because we are connected to the world. We are not only a mind, but we're also a body. And both things, they are not completely separated from each other, but they're bleeding into each other. They feed on each other, and they allow us to do things that seem to be very strange and unique, as, for example, physics or engineering or mathematics, that allow us to influence and manipulate the world and anticipate the world in a way that is not completely self-evident how human beings can describe and explain how the heavenly bodies and the galaxies moves and how they behave. Things that are hundreds of billions of light years away. We can exactly say like, oh yeah, this star is built up like this and these things are moving like this. And this is an enormous, interesting psychological thing that we do not question so much, but it's amazing to think about. And what Jung would do, and this is classical Jung, he would look into all different avenues of human scientific endeavor or cultural products and try to find out more about the human psyche and how everything is connected. So also here, he takes physics and tries to find things that kind of not prove him right, but bring him into giving him indication what is the right way to go to explain and experience things. This is how he then can combine physics with dream symbology or with yoga and also alchemy and hermeneutical thought. So this is Jung wandering the earth, looking at things and combining them all. And yeah, having really interesting thoughts in the process. And this was this event's topic. And I want to thank you for paying attention. Now I'm very interested in the discussion about this, strange topic of physics and numbers and psychology. So, thank you all.
This was this event's topic. Thanks for tuning in. If you're interested in learning more about Jung, please check out the description.